Welcome to the Gospel Addict podcast. I'm Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Jim, you just recently taught on the book of Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, although we won't really cover Song of Solomon that much, but and I loved it. I loved your presentation.
Oh, thanks, Craig.
It was fantastic. I mean, very well organized. But let's just dive in with that. What were some of the things that changes you would make if you were to teach it again?
Well, there's a bunch of little things. So I think I don't know where to start. Just in terms of a speaking exercise, because we touched on this a moment ago, talking about your presentation of the Psalms in Psalm 119. When you have a time slot, and we have an hour and 15 minutes. I used to kind of plan, like an hour and 15 minutes worth of material. And well, that doesn't work because the people want to contribute, and there's a lot of interaction in the study. And not this one, but the one before, I said, I'm going to plan about 45 minutes, 50 minutes worth of material. There's plenty of time. And so that, for me, takes a lot of stress off the timing of it, because there's always, one of the biggest stressor is not so much covering the material. It's like, how do I time this out? And I say, I'm going to time less. And what happened this time, I had about 50 minutes of speaking and then any questions. And then we had about 20 minutes of conversation about it, and people really had lots of thoughts on it, which I really like. So if part of that is, if I feel like if there's no conversation, people are like, oh, that's nice, I gotta go, and you're not touching anyone, right? So the fact that it spurs thoughts, I think, helps me feel like it's reaching people. And but then when I say 5 minutes at the end for Song of Songs, and that's all I really want to say about Song of Songs. So that timing part was good. But to do that, then you end up, a lot of things end up on the cutting room floor. And so some of the things we talked about, like in the pre-podcast, we were talking about that. So like when I was talking about the 3 different ways of living: achievement-based life, cause-based life, pleasure-based life. And I mentioned cause-based is DC, and then achievement-based is New York. In the pre-podcast, I had some stories about New York and New York's history, and there's just no time to bring those out, so just cut those out. And there's a bunch of little details like that. Like if I said, you got 2.5 hours to do this. Oh, okay, great. I got all kinds of, and then you just put it all out there, and I can keep cutting to get it down now. And I think that I like this pattern now. Do like 45 to 55 minutes. And then look at people interrupt you after you say 2 words, and your hand goes up. Okay, no sweat. We can talk, and you're not stressed about getting through your stuff. So.
Are there any stories? Any stories looking back, you wish you would have swapped out? Or
well, there's 1 or 2 in the appendix. One thing I had this good stuff in the appendix. So let's get to that in this podcast a little bit. There's a couple of verses in there about that we'll get to that I think are like money's the answer to everything. And we talked about a little bit in the pre-podcast, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So all those verses that I thought were like Solomon's wisdom, those all got in the cutting room floor. I took them all out like the night before. I had a whole section on, I basically was saying, here's the 3 sections of the book. We're going to talk about the professor's disillusionment, his attempts to find meaning, and his conclusion. And in the middle there was going to be all of the professor's wisdom. So when he says all these great sayings about, there's a time for everything, or actually I wasn't going to cover that. But money's the answer to everything, and great sayings, his wisdom. I left all that out because I knew, I'll never get through all this stuff, and I'll feel pressure to get through all this stuff. So that's some stuff I left out. Anyway, so that was one thing. I think one of the things I think now as I look back on it, Greg, to kind of that I try to do, and I don't know if I do it well, is I try to really be clear that, usually when I give these talks, clearly for me, Tim Keller is my largest influence spiritually. He's my largest influence spiritually in general, purposely. I mean, it has changed my life, attending Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City and being there, listening to Tim Keller talk and then listening to him afterwards for years. So in when I'm giving the talk, I try to give attribution clearly and say these are not this thought is not my thought. This comes from Tim Keller. Or in general, a lot of the thoughts here are from, and sometimes they even say, here are the names of the sermons. Go get them.
Yeah.
Make sure I'm giving credit where credit is due. So no one says, wow, Jim, I can't believe you came up with this scheme to say that there's a 3 ways to live: achievement, causes, and pleasure. Like that's straight from Tim Keller. That's not me. And try to make sure I give credit where credit is due. I don't want to people say brilliant idea, Jim, and say, well, the brilliance is Tim Keller, not me.
Well, and you do a great job. You do a great job with that. And the reality is all of us stand on the shoulders of other people.
That's right.
It's I love the quote, originality is the art of forgetting your source. And I don't even know who said that. So it must be original with me.
That's funny. That's hilarious. Well, and Tim Keller, he himself says his sources are C.S. Lewis and Jonathan Edwards, other sources too. But that reminds me of another quote. I was going to bring this up when I was talking about a cause-based life, and I have this quote. I'm not sure. I'm sure I could Google it in 2 seconds, find out who said it. But the saying is, "Life is for others." We all know that's true. Life is for others. What the others are here for, I have no idea. So I just love that. Life is for others. What the others are here for, I have no idea. I thought that was funny. I'm sure I could Google it in maybe 2 seconds, find out who said it. So
like a guy named W.H. Auden.
That's his phrase?
Yeah.
W.H. Auden said that?
That's what I don't even tell me. What's he a poet?
Oh yeah, famous author, poet. He wrote great work, Stop All the Clocks. W.H. Auden is fantastic.
We are all here on earth to help others. What on earth the others are here for, I don't know. W.H. Auden.
I was paraphrasing him. Thank you. I'll make that in my notes. W.H. Auden. It's yeah, he's got a lot of it's great works, and I think he might have been a believer too. So anyway, so that's one thing, like this fight distinguishing between what's Keller and what's yours. And then one of the big points in the talk, as you may recall, is when I got to chapter 9, I brought the gospel in. And that was one and you and I talked about ahead of time. That was one I was a bit nervous about. That's not Keller. That was my kind of take on it, and for better.
I love that verse. Mention it here, because for people that didn't.
Sure. So maybe if you missed the talk or whatever, but was trying to say, like, what's the professor's conclusion? Because he tries to find meaning in all these things and achievements and causes and then a pleasure-based life. And then he says, and I said, now the exciting conclusion, and there's in chapter 12, there's a verse where he says, this is the conclusion: fear God is keep his commandments. So I thought, aha, everyone's going to think that's what I'm going to go to. But I said, no, let's go to chapter 9 first. And chapter 9, verse 7 says, go then, eat your bread in happiness and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already approved your works. And I tried to stress this, that's pure gospel, because it cannot mean universal salvation. And not to reiterate what I talked about, but this is what we talked about in the talk.
Yeah.
But for the believer, where God had you put your faith in Christ, God has approved your works. And then to bring up the gospel, it's not your works he's approving. It's Jesus' works attributed to you. It's what you just mentioned, substitutionary atonement, right? The whole gospel is in Ecclesiastes chapter 9. God has approved your works there, so therefore your standing is complete. And I really want to dwell on this, Greg. I hope this came out. This befuddled Christian view of pleasure, like, can I have an ice cream cone? That whole notion, like, is it okay to have fun once in a while, right? And is it okay to just enjoy life? And I think that Christian confusion, I generally believe that there's confusion, that most Christians say, I don't really have a good theory on that. I don't really know if it's okay. I'm going to sneak it in anyway. I'm just going to do it. And I'm going to get the ice cream cone. I'm going to, or whatever it is. And I was trying to lend some coherency to that, to say, look, you can't sin. Don't get drunk. Right. But it's really okay to enjoy life. And in fact, Solomon goes on in chapter 9, the next verse, he says, let your clothes be white all the time, not black and mourning, right? Let your clothes be white all the time. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life, which he has given to you under the sun. Now, here is one thing I thought of later that I wish I'd brought up. Solomon had like what 700 wives and 300 concubines, right?
Right. Maybe
So
800.
so I mentioned at one point in the talk, look, like Solomon would tell you, if you're saying, if only I had endless stream of lovers, life would be complete, things would be great. And I said, Solomon is saying, oh no, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be. I've tried that. And I wonder if God took Solomon and said, look, Solomon, you're going to write Ecclesiastes a thought experiment. Before you do that, I'm make an experiment with you. I'm going to let you be the human being that goes to the end of the three paths. You're going to go full on cause based life, full on achievement based life, full on pleasure based life. You're going to get to the end of those paths. And even in the pleasure, I skipped this too, Greg. In the pleasure based life, he talks about, I think we men read this, we see the harem part and all the wives and the women, but he talks about drinking wine too. So like substances and whatever. Now he would say substance abuse. I just partied my heart out, right? Someone would use
Right.
different language, but he's like, I had wine and the delights of men. I had all this stuff. So they're like, I'm pushing substance abuse too. I'm going to like really push the limits of pleasure in every hedonistic way I can. Um, and I think maybe God said, I'm going to let you do that to report back to the world on what it's like at the end of the path, right? It's not because God's not, because Christians say, well, God let him have all these wives. How could that be right? And God's saying it's not right. It's not, just because he did it doesn't make it right, but it does make a huge spiritual point. He had all that you long for, that a lot of people long for. If only I could do these things, right? And they said I had it, and it's not what you think. It would not do for you what you think it would do for you. And the part of the proof that I left out, Greg, is this verse 9, when he says, enjoy life with the woman whom you love. It's singular.
Yeah.
It's not, hey, and if you could be like me and have 100 wives, knock yourself out. There's none of that. It's almost like a refutation of his own life, right? He comes back
Yeah.
and says, let me tell you what you should do. The one woman you love. And Proverbs talks about the wife of your youth, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Singular, right?
Right.
Unitary, like this, like, you know what you should do? Don't do what I did. Enjoy life with the woman whom you love, with your spouse, all the days of your life. That's your reward. And I kind of wish I dwelled on that a little more, but because it really is a kind of repudiation of his own lifestyle with his harems and all the rest. So
That's good. That's good. Does it ever bother you? Because sometimes it's hard for me to reconcile in my mind how, when Solomon was granted one wish and he asked God for wisdom,
yeah,
and God gives him wisdom. And then yet his whole life is like this, kind of like goes off the train tracks, and um it's like, I just, for years I was like, if he's so wise, how could he stray so far?
right.
Do you think it's because God gave him worldly wisdom, but not necessarily spiritual
No,
wisdom?
I think it's I never thought of the distinction, Greg. I don't know. Maybe you're right. I think God said, I'm going to give you wisdom and I'm going to give you these experiences, and you're going to be able to reflect back on how great those were, and were you able to find meaning in life in those ways? Because
Well,
you
like,
know,
because you did a great job bringing out. I love that you brought this out. The whole idea of being under the sun,
yeah.
and how
Well, the up and about
under when you're under the sun, there's a way that seems wise to a man,
right,
but
right,
the proverb says there's a way that seems wise to a man. In the end, it leads to death.
right,
But then in the book of Ecclesiastes, he's able to go above the clouds.
right.
And that's where I kind of see, there's worldly wisdom, and there's earthly wisdom, and then there's godly wisdom.
Oh, in that sense,
Um,
yeah. Well, maybe that's a way to say he did have it all, because there's times he's using godly wisdom where he says, look, obey God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. And then he's below the clouds, saying you're just like animals and there's no point and we all die and death ruins everything. And, so, you know, that's maybe your earthly wisdom.
right. So what else
Um,
stood out to you?
well, a little bit like you when you were saying that, when you were talking about Psalm 119, you say, "Ooh, what a great thought!" Someone said the first verse is symmetry with the last verse. I think during ours, and I know that for the sake of time, some of the Q&A was edited out, so I'm not sure it'll make the podcast post. But during the Q&A, one of the commenters said, he made a really great point. I had said during the course of the talk that one of the things that Solomon concludes is that everything's meaningless because of death, because death ends everything. So he says, "Look, I can achieve all this stuff, but I can hand it off to someone else who's going to inherit it, and they might be a fool." So death renders a lot of his life meaningless. But it was Tim Miller actually who in our Bible study who chimed in and said it's actually two things that he talks about, and the point is that you don't control either of them. One is death that you have no control over, and the other one is time that you have no control over. And that's the point of that long passage at the beginning of chapter 3,
Mm,
where it was made into a folk song to everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. It's chapter 3, starts at verse 1. There's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, and so on and so on. And the point was, you don't control death. You can be as wise as you want. You don't control death and you don't control time. It's out of your control. And that's what gives him the wisdom. And of course, as soon as he said it, like just like you, when you the Psalm 119,
yeah.
first and last verse that you were talking about in the last
You're like,
podcast,
why didn't I think of that?
oh, it was such a great, it's so great. But that's the way the Lord works. That's the way the Holy Spirit works. And I think that's one of the actual beauties of getting. That's why God wants Christians to gather together in fellowship, right? There are things that
Right.
you'll see.
That is one of the nice things about the allowing for other people, like the a community of minds,
That's right.
because you do, um yeah. I mean, even sometimes when you and I are talking, like we'll read one of us will make a comment and be like, "Oh, I never thought of that. I never saw it that way."
Yeah.
And that those are awesome times. So yeah, um, yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Uh,
that was a good moment. And I think that's actually a really great thing about it. So there were a couple other things. There was, like I said, the professor's wisdom that ended up on the cutting room floor. But I think we talked about this a little bit during the pre-podcast, the verse that says money's the answer to everything, and how hard people stumble on that verse. And I think we talked about this in the pre-podcast, Greg, that a lot of the commentaries I read skip that verse entirely. They don't know what to make of it. It's
mm,
odd. They're talking about the few verses before it, and they have all these commentary. They skip that verse and they go right to the next one. Like there's if they're throwing up their hands. And
yeah.
how could he say money's the answer? What does it mean that he says money's the answer to everything? And for our listeners, it's chapter 10, verse 19. Men prepare a meal for enjoyment, and wine makes life merry, and money is the answer to everything. You think, how does the Bible say money's the answer to everything? How could that be? And the answer, first of all, is that he cannot possibly mean that he really thinks money is the answer, because he's just talked about how achievement is not fulfilling, and he tried that and it didn't work. So he can't mean that. But he very, very quickly, all the verses around are talking about bad leadership and bad kingdoms, and how. So what he's saying is, these types of bad leaders, their kingdoms fall apart, and they're the ones who are drinking wine and eating their meals in enjoyment and just say money's the answer to everything. They're running their kingdom for money. So it's just another example of bad leadership. That was one commentary that made that clear. And then the light bulb went off, said, "Oh yeah, of course, that's the obvious meaning." So,
Mm.
um, yeah, that was one thing. And then the other verses are really great. And it's just like when you're doing the Psalms. There's so many great ones, like Psalm 139. You wish you could dwell on them, but there's the famous passage in Ecclesiastes: two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. This is chapter 4, verse 9.
Yeah. The cord of three strands.
Exactly. It's so great, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
and you tell me, what does it mean, Greg?
Well, I mean, the cord of three strands is the third strand is God. It's Jesus. It's
Right.
it's the key to a strong marriage. Is to put is letting letting Jesus be that third strand, and three strands tied together make a strong rope.
Right, right. And so that the whole passage is talking about two, 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 and the last one says a cord of three strands, and you're right. But the Lord's there in that relationship. It just changes the whole, makes it so strong and changes it. So that's such a great verse. You just
Yeah.
read, you just don't want to leave it out, right? But in the interest of time, that was one. And then there's another one in chapter 9, verse 11 that says, I have seen something else under the sun. Again, this is under the sun thinking, right? The race is not to the swift or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise or wealth to the brilliant or favor to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. And
Mm.
that notion of like randomness of life, it's like it doesn't always work out fairly the way you think it's going to work out. The race is not to the swift, the battle is not always to the strong. And it's what we talked about with wisdom literature. Proverbs says this is the way generally it should work. You live according to Christian principles, biblical, godly principles, life turns out well. And Ecclesiastes and Job come along and say, well, not always. There's a lot of randomness of life too. And and then Greg, I was going to say, I remember quoting this once to someone, a young businessman, and he said, I said, like, there's so much randomness in life, and he said, his response was, yeah, but I'd like to see the percentages. But if you work hard, you do these things, make the right moves, chances are life will turn out well. And maybe there's some wisdom in his response because that you should try to do the right thing in life and work hard with integrity and all those other principles of living. And generally speaking, yes, there is randomness in life, but generally speaking, life does go better. So,
Yeah, and then
anyway,
you didn't talk about Ecclesiastes 11, verse 1. Cast your bread upon the waters.
yes,
You'll find it after many days.
isn't that's a song that goes like that?
Cast your bread upon the waters. Um, I'm not sure, was that speaking of generosity? Give your material things to the needy.
I don't know. Cast your bread upon the waters. The song ties that together with good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. Who did that song? It's an old Christian kind of folk song. Um, one of our listeners will know and they'll let us know. Um, but no, I missed that verse, Greg. I'm not sure. I don't even know what it means. Cast your bread on the surface of the waters. You will find it after many days. Divide your portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune will occur upon the earth. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain on the earth, and whether a tree falls to the south or to the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies.
Yeah, that's that's one of those that almost sounds like a Stephen Wright, saying if a tree falls to the south or the north, where it falls, there it lies.
There
That
it
reminds
lies.
me of Stephen Wright, where he says, "Man, if your car keys accidentally fall into a river of molten lava, let them go, because man, they're gone."
That's right. That's right.
Wisdom. Uh, that's
There's a, yes, there was an old movie I remember where the catchphrase was "Wherever you go." We always remember wherever you go, there you are.
there you are. Yeah.
It's called, yes, it's a tautology. It's self-evident. Um,
So some of the commentators I'm looking at think that cast your bread upon the waters is all about generosity. It's giving your material things to the needy in a way that might seem wasteful. Wasteful is like throwing your bread upon the waters, but then you'll be rewarded. So it's like do something now for a reward that cannot be immediately seen.
yeah, that's good. You'll
But
cast your bread
but
in the
you
water
but
to
you
find
brought
it after
this
many
but
days.
you did bring this out like that towards these chapters they're almost like proverbs.
Right. It's wisdom literature. Here's some thoughts I have on how to live and right, what life is about.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, and the right, like a part of this, and this kind of ties in with the way I was talking about pleasure, how it's okay to have pleasure and enjoy life. There's a phrase he mentions, like it comes up 3 times. I saw there's nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work because that is their lot. It's almost the same exact phraseology. It comes up in chapter 5, verse 18, chapter 3, 22, and then chapter 2, verse 24. And the key for that thought was it's in chapter 2. It says, a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. Like, enjoy your work. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? And the point of it is you have to be with him first. If you're with him, if you're in him, if you're saved, if you're a believer, if you're in Christ, then you can find happiness in these things because you're not looking for them to form the basis of your identity. You're free from that and you can actually enjoy them. But that, I thought that was actually great verses, but they were redundant with a thought I was already talking about from chapter 9, verse 7. So there was no point to say it again. I just kind of left it out.
Yeah. Is that the last thing you would change? Or
Yeah, I think so. And then want to talk about Song of Solomon for a minute?
yeah, I thought you did a great job
5 minutes.
yeah, expressing the different views of it. I thought that was very interesting, and how they're very adamant, very strong feelings against the people that believe different than them.
That's right. That's right. And big names. I didn't mention this, but John MacArthur is one, is Literalville. No, absolutely not allegorical.
Oh, it's just literal. It's just a lover, and really.
Well, and I think there are people who say, if I don't, I will dilute scripture somehow. It seems like that's the backdrop of,
But there's so much in the Old Testament that there's all kinds of allegories about Israel.
Oh, yeah. I think, let me find the verse now, where the Bible itself, New Testament writers refer to the Old Testament in allegorical terms. Galatians, this is the one I was thinking of. In Galatians 4, Paul is talking, Galatians 4:24. He's talking about freedom and Christian liberty and like being the law versus grace. And he talks about Abraham had verse 22, Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman and one by the free woman. And then verse 23, the son of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son of the free woman according to the promise. So he's talking about, grace versus works. Verse 24, this is Paul writing. This is allegorically speaking, for these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem. We don't have to talk about it anymore, but he's clearly reading that Old Testament passage allegorically. He says so. It's not like it's wrong to do that. You do have to interpret scriptures. You can't get too far, but it really felt like almost a hostility from the literal people towards the allegorical point of view. Like, oh no, don't go there. Not 1 minute. So,
do you feel solidly where you stand on this?
I've always thought it was allegorical. I thought the whole beauty of it is allegorical. I thought the whole point of, like, why is there a love story in the middle of the Bible? And the literal people say, well, it's just there to say romance is okay and sex is okay. It's like a little lesson for us all. Okay, that's nice, but it's such a gushy love poem.
Yeah.
Oh, and you talked about how Psalm 151 was not canon. People like for early on, Song of Songs supposedly from very early on said, people said, oh, that's inspired scripture. Like,
really?
Yeah, I mean, this is long before Christianity. This is in the Jewish. Supposedly, they easily right away that's inspired, because they thought this is really allegorically about God's love for His people.
Yeah,
and it is. It's just now we say His people are really Christ, the church, Christ's bride, right?
Yeah.
But they always thought that way. Like, this is God gushing over us, and that's why we gush over Him, because for the whole Bible, soup to nuts, start to finish, is meant to be a love story. I had you and I lost you, and I'll go to any lengths to get you back.
Yeah.
So yeah, like that, I've kind of come down to the allegorical side. I was actually surprised to see people strongly against reading it that way. I thought, okay, well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's the way I feel too. I mean, and it fits with the rest of Scripture. It fits with kind of the overall theme of the Bible, that the Bible is a love story from,
That's right.
It's God's love for us, and how we're the ones who stray away from him. And
Well, look at
so,
Hosea. Look at the whole book of Hosea, right? Where the God tells the prophet, I want you to marry a prostitute. The whole thing is an allegorical relationship to represent God's, love for his people and how his people have gone astray, and yet God still comes after them and loves them.
yeah,
So,
it's written by
um,
Solomon, and Solomon loved all these different women, but here he's writing about one woman,
right, right, right.
which
Oh,
I
and so
wonder if that ties into that verse you mentioned earlier that, hey,
right, oh, the one I lost,
the one that you really love,
maybe, right.
um, be a one woman man kind of thing.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right. And the inverse is true. Be a one guy gal, I guess, or however you'd say it. Be a one man woman.
right. Uh,
Um,
that's interesting. Anything else about song? You
well, yeah, I did find it interesting. I read one interpretation how they tried to. It's all written in first person. My lover is this. My lover is that. And there's some headings that kind of give you an idea of who's saying what and when. But the notion of who's saying what and why, there were different interpretations of that. And the one I read in the class was one commentator that said, okay, this is the way the pattern: girl meets boy, girl separated from boy, girl meets king, king likes girl, girl resists king, girl reunited with boy. That's just one interpretation. There were others that read it differently, like what the point is. So um, that one made a lot of sense to me when I went back and read it, but there's different points of view on that. So um,
mm,
I'm not sure what is to be gained by going down that rabbit hole. I thought that's one way to look at it that makes sense, but you know, there's
yeah.
not much to debate that.
Well, Jim, I think this has been good. We've is there anything else you want to say about Ecclesiastes or Song of Solomon? I think
There's one thought, but I think you can probably cut this out later in post and edit this out. But I'll tell you. But I think you would probably edit this out. We were talking about that idea of money is the answer to everything. I don't know if I ever told you this, Greg, but when I went to New York and worked there, and I thought about telling this story when we were there, but I cut this out too. Um, my dad worked in a factory and I don't think he ever made more than 22,000 dollars a year, something like that. And when I went to New York and the amounts of money, one of the first deals I did as a lawyer, did I tell you this? The guy,
I don't
he made
remember.
we sold his business. It was a mutual fund business. He made $125 million personally, and he bought the most expensive apartment in Manhattan at the time. Um, I think it was $50 million. Maybe it was like $100 million. I don't remember. It was such an astronomical amount of money, and I just never seen money. People think, my parents wanted to make sure I had a job that had health benefits. Make sure you get a
Right.
job with benefits because that's when you were flipping burgers in high school, you didn't have benefits. So it's important when you go to college, you get a job with benefits. And these are people making hundreds of millions of dollars. And then the thought, Greg, was not just the personal wealth of individuals, because that was staggering to begin with, but the sheer size of the money when you start dealing with the capital markets. So you start dealing with helping companies access capital, hundreds of millions of dollars at a time. And then I realized, here's my big thought on, and this was actually my first thought when I read Money's the Answer to Everything. Um, the money, the money is so enormous. It's almost an entity unto itself. The money is almost like a living and breathing entity
Hmm.
that is always, always hungry and seeking return. And governments try to grab it and say, well, I'd like some of that. And I'm going to divert it to this purpose. And the money says, nope, we're going to go over here. So if the Chinese government, for example, clamps down on Hong Kong and says, no, we don't like this, we want to take all the money, will say, okay, we're going to go to Singapore. And the money will just move. The money is like as cold and brutal as outer space and as living and breathing as a newborn baby and hungry.
Ah,
It never sleeps. That phrase from the movie Wall Street: money never sleeps.
yeah.
Money is always on the lookout. And there's a sense in which it's always seeking a productive return So the vast quantity of money, not the few pennies you and I get to take home as a paycheck, but the vast quantity of money is roaming the surface of the earth, like as if the earth is formless and void, and the money is always circling the globe, looking for a productive use to cultivate creation and make it more productive. If
Wow.
there's a solar panel plant in the Philippines, it'll find it. And if there's a lithium mine in Iceland, or Greenland, it'll find it and fund those. They're constantly seeking the productive. And someone says, you ought to do this other cause over here. Nope. Well, the money will, yep, we'll do that for a while, but then move over here. And the money is a living and breathing entity in a way that I'd never expected. And that was my New York experience. So you can cut all that out from the talk, Greg.
That's very interesting, and that makes me want to. We should talk sometime about whether or not there'll be money in heaven.
Well, yeah, interesting.
Can you have heaven without money or currency or
Well, you could say the money itself isn't bad. It's the love of money, it's the abuse of money, it's the greed, right? But as a medium of exchange, it's an efficient medium of exchange. So you kind of need all that. And if you're in a world where everyone is completely other centered, I'm not hoarding, I'm not greedy, I'm not worried about my next day or my next meal. So I think there can be absolutely be money in heaven. It just but it wouldn't be viewed the same. It wouldn't have the same significance. It wouldn't have the same distortions it has here. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.